If you're new to the military, the whole idea of a court-martial can seem, well, like a totally different universe. It's complicated, it can be intimidating, for sure. So our goal today is to cut right through all that confusion and give you a clear, straightforward guide on how this system actually works.
Okay, so here's our game plan for this explainer. We're going to start with the big question, why does the military even have its own separate justice system? Then, we'll break down the 3 different levels of trial, figure out who can actually fall under military law, the answer might surprise you, and really importantly, cover the rights you have as a service member. And finally, we'll get into the serious, long-term impact a conviction can have on your life.
All right, let's dive right into Section 1. We're going to tackle the what and, probably more importantly, the why behind the whole military court system.
So the first question pretty much everyone has is why, right? I mean, why go to all the trouble of creating this parallel legal system? What's wrong with the regular civilian courts that everybody else in the country uses?
Well, the answer really starts with what a court-martial is. At its heart, it's a criminal court, but it's one that's been built from the ground up specifically for the military. So picture a normal trial, but the judge is a military officer, the lawyers are military officers, and the jury, which, by the way, they call a panel, is made up of other service members.
And this whole system operates under its own set of laws. It's all governed by what's called the Uniform Code of Military Justice, or the UCMJ for short. Think of it as the official rulebook for the armed forces. Now, it covers crimes you'd recognize anywhere, stuff like theft or assault, but it also has a whole category of offenses that just don't exist in the civilian world.
And this is really where you see why a separate system is so critical. You hear the phrase good order and discipline all the time, right? Well, it's the absolute bedrock of an effective military. Offenses like desertion, insubordination, or disobeying a lawful order from a superior, there's just no real civilian equivalent for that. In a military setting, those actions can have life or death consequences, and that's exactly what the UCMJ is built to address.
So now that we have a handle on why this system exists, let's get into how it actually works. In Section 2, we're going to look at the 3 different levels of trial, which cover everything from really minor stuff all the way up to the most serious crimes.
Yeah, this is not a one-size-fits-all kind of deal. The system is broken up into 3 tiers, and honestly, the best way to wrap your head around it is to just think about the civilian world. There's a huge difference between going to court for a speeding ticket and being on trial for a major felony, right? Well, that same logic applies here.
This chart breaks it all down pretty clearly. At the bottom rung, you've got the summary court-martial. This is for minor offenses, and it's overseen by just one commissioned officer. The analogy here is perfect. It's basically like being sent to the principal's office. Then you step up to the special court-martial, which is a lot like a misdemeanor court in the civilian world. And then at the very top, you have the general court-martial. This is the big one. It's for felony-level offenses, and it's where the most severe punishments, even up to life in prison, can be handed down.
Okay, so we've got the what and the how, but what about the who? In Section 3, we're going to look at exactly who falls under military law, and I think you might be surprised by the answer.
You'd probably assume this system is only for people currently wearing the uniform, but that's not always the case. The UCMJ itself actually has some really specific exceptions. Just take a look at this direct quote from Article 2 of the UCMJ. It actually extends military law to civilians, specifically those working with the armed forces in the field during a war. So, to put it all in one place, here's the rundown of who can be subject to military jurisdiction. Of course, you've got all active duty members, and also Reserve and National Guard members who are on active status. But here's where it gets interesting. Military retirees who are receiving pay can fall under it, and like we just saw, even certain civilians, like a Department of Defense contractor out in a war zone. Now, it's pretty rare for those last 2 for sure, but it is a crucial part of the law to know about.
All right, now for what is maybe the most important section in this whole explainer. If you ever find yourself in this system, what are your rights? Let's talk about the protections and the resources that are there for you.
Let's be absolutely crystal clear on this. When you put on a uniform, you do not give up your constitutional protections. You have the right to remain silent, you are protected from unreasonable search and seizure, and you absolutely have the right to a fair trial, the right to confront your accusers, and the right to appeal if you're convicted.
And here's the bottom line, the big one. If you are facing a special or a general court-martial, the military is required to provide you with a lawyer, and it will not cost you a single penny.
And we're not just talking about any lawyer they can find. Each branch has its own version of what the Army calls the Trial Defense Service, or TDS. And the key word here is independent. Their one and only job is to give you free, confidential legal advice. To be clear,
They work for you, the accused. They do not work for your chain of command. That is a huge deal.
And finally, let's talk about the stakes. Because understanding the process is one thing, but it's just as important to understand what happens after a verdict is read. Section 5 is all about the long-term consequences of a conviction.
You see, a guilty verdict isn't just about whether you face time in confinement. It almost always kicks off this cascade of other penalties that can pretty much destroy a military career. It usually starts with getting busted down in rank, then you can lose your pay and allowances, and it can all end with a punitive discharge, getting kicked out of the service.
Now, it's really important to know that not all punitive discharges are created equal. There's a bad conduct discharge, which is really serious and can cost you most of your VA benefits, but then there's the dishonorable discharge. That is the absolute worst-case scenario. It strips you of all your benefits, and it follows you for the rest of your life with a heavy, heavy stigma.
And that brings us to our last, really critical question to think about. At some point, every single service member's time in uniform ends. So how does a decision made in a military courtroom today end up affecting the entire rest of your life as a civilian tomorrow? Understanding those stakes, that's crucial for every single person who wears the uniform.